Welcome to another edition of Steelers Latest with your host, Jason Nazario, aka J Reels, as we chronicle the Steelers throughout training camp preseason leading up to week one of the NFL season. Now, last night was the first preseason game, and it was very impressive. What could you say after a relatively slow start offensively, where although they did get in the end zone and the quarterbacks were fantastic, which I'll get to in the next topic, but for the game overall, the second half was certainly one that you're going to look at as a Steeler fan. Albeit, I get it, against second and third stringers, but you have to be encouraged by what you saw with the way the offense had worked for the Steelers last night. And considering that they did use all the quarterbacks, other than Aaron Rodgers, of course, and everyone was effective and efficient. And when we break it all down, it's going to be a net positive to know that if this team and the way the offense is constructed, that any quarterback could go in there, plug and play, and be successful. Maybe they'll be a Super Bowl winner after all. Now, of course, I got to pump the brakes. I can't get too crazy about that. But in all seriousness, even though the takeaways last night are from a plus side, and you take a look, especially at the quarterback position, as we all know, is the most important position there on the field. And for the guys that we know that are going to be there, at least throughout the remainder of training camp, and who knows who's going to be left standing as far as will the team take 4 quarterbacks on the roster? Will it be 3? Will one be on the practice squad? That we'll have to wait and see. But based on what we saw there last night in the game where the Steelers won 28-9, you have to be impressed by what they did in all 3 facets, not only just with the offense, the defense, even the special teams for that matter. So game number 1 in the books, and I'm sure when they get to the film room today, they're going to see a lot of positives, more so than the negatives. But you know how coaches are. Coach McCarthy, I'm sure, is probably looking at all the negatives and the positives that he saw last night. And I can understand that. Things that need to be cleaned up, need to be shored up, things of that nature. So the Steelers, at least for one night, albeit preseason and albeit against guys like you and I, who probably won't even be in the league by the time you get to the latter part of the month, but still it was an encouraging sign to see the Steelers play so well there in their first preseason game. Now I want to get to the quarterbacks, as we have Drew Aller, which will be the next thing I want to discuss, and that is a big highlight that I want to address. But the quarterbacks overall, look at those stats. 27 for 33, 313 yards, 2 touchdowns, no interceptions. And of course, that's the big one, or even fumbles for that matter, because what you want to look at is the quarterback not being able to turn the ball over. And when you have Mason Rudolph, a guy who we think is going to be the backup, was certainly very good. What was he? I believe 10 of 11 off the top of my head. And certainly was efficient throwing the ball down the field. Now, they were able to get into the end zone after Mason Rudolph had his series or 2 to start the game. But when we look at the other 2 quarterbacks, and that's going to be the highlight here, Will Howard, the 6th-round pick, Ohio State, who got some playing time yesterday and certainly did very well in his time there, 7 for 9, and being effective. Now, a lot of the throws were short, nothing that was going to be of high-risk caliber. A thing where Howard, who was trying to see whether or not he could be the 3rd-string quarterback on this team, considering that the following guy, which we'll touch on in a moment, is going to be breathing down his neck for a roster spot when it's all said and done. But you got to like what you saw there with Howard, who knows his way around big games. And granted that the preseason isn't going to compare to a national championship game that he was in 2 years ago, but Howard showed a lot of poise. He didn't seem to panic. He seemed to get his reads, checkdowns, etc. They seemed to be pretty fine. And Howard, at least for this week, looked like he's in the running for that 3rd string to be a guy that would follow behind Aaron Rodgers and Mason Rudolph. And the other thing, too, is that Will Howard, based on some of the things that I've read after his first week in camp, which looked very good, the last week, not so much. He actually slipped a little bit, didn't really perform to the level that he did in that first week of training camp. And then now here it was, game time, under the lights, against a team where I understand, again, it's not as if he's going against the first-string guys and a first-team defense, but still, you could have put me there. If I'm going to be 7 for 9, they're going to look at me and say, well, Jay Reels, you did pretty good this first week. Let's see how many reps you get this week going into the next game when they have the Jets coming to Acrisure Stadium next week. But for Will Howard, you liked what you saw there. And then Drew Aller. This is the one that I want to get to because, and before I even get to him, we know that the quarterback position moving forward down the road is going to be of the utmost. And that's the big question mark, whether or not that this team actually has their quarterback of the future on the roster. And we have 2 guys that were drafted, I understand, one in the 6th round and another in the 3rd. It's not as if these guys were high picks or someone like Ben Roethlisberger back in 2004. Oh, geez, if we could have another one of those on our roster, we'd be set. But for right now, this is what we're looking at here. And as we get to and see what's going to happen here with a guy like Drew Aller, this is going to be the most encouraging thing. Because last night, what you saw there, he was able to go 10 for 13. He had 153 yards, 3 total TDs, including 1 running. He had the big pass play, which I'll get to in the final notable there. But for Aller, and this is the one that I really want to unpack, and I talked about this when we highlighted the quarterback position there going back a few episodes ago. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel, definitely do so, because I certainly uncovered what I think could be the guy of the future. And that's no knock on Will Howard. That's no knock on even Mason Rudolph for that matter. But Drew Aller could be the guy. And what you saw out of Aller last night was very encouraging. Now, I understand one more time, they had me playing defense back there, and that's no diss to the Packers' second, third, or even fourth-string guys for that matter. But for Aller, he made one bad throw, which was there on the goal line after that big play that he had to Caden Weejan, and for Weejan to go 75 yards, and one more time, he's going to be one of the highlights there in the final topic. But for Aller, I thought that was his one bad throw after that big play, trying to get the ball to Riley Nowakowski, who, I get it that Nowakowski should have caught it, but it was a scenario where the ball was a little bit not out of reach. Again, you could blame Nowakowski, but if it was a better throw, there would have been no excuses for Nowakowski to make the catch. And then Nowakowski later on got a touchdown from Aller, which came in the fourth quarter. But for Aller, you like what you see physically. I mean, the guy is tall, built. I even compared him to a guy with that size to Josh Allen. Now, I'm not comparing talent, people, so let's not get crazy. But for Aller, a guy who came from Penn State, you already know, Ohio kid, Happy Valley. I'm sure he knows his way around Pittsburgh just based on what he heard there on campus those last couple of years there as a Nittany Lion. But for Aller, he could be that guy. He really could. And again, I'm not going to go crazy over one performance there in the first preseason game. No, but you saw the tools. And one more time, I can't stress it enough. With the way that the offense is structured, or so it seems there by Mike McCarthy, we would think that no matter who it is, whether it's Aaron Rodgers, a future Hall of Famer, or a guy in his first training camp like Drew Aller, he's going to simplify it because he knows that he wants to have the quarterback get the ball out of their hands quickly with that young offensive line, which is going to be a very important unit. If you haven't seen any of the previous videos, I talked about the offensive line being a critical factor here this upcoming season. But when we take a look at Aller and just the physical makeup, I mean, that's a guy that you want. I'm sure every GM in the league would want a guy that's 6'5", 225, 28 pounds, a guy with a very strong arm. Now, we understand him in big games, he hasn't really delivered, as we saw there in the Big Ten Championship 2 years ago, and even in the bowl game against Notre Dame. I mean, those are two instances right there where Aller didn't really deliver. And you have to say to yourself, can this guy, for the school that he went to and for the big profile, not only of the university, but also the games and the conference that he played in, can he somehow, some way shake that off? Because now it's a whole different ballgame. He is not facing the Purdue's of the world by any stretch of the imagination, or Minnesota, any of those type of teams. So you have to think that the physical makeup is there, but what about the mental makeup and even the emotional makeup? Because when things are going bad, when things are in the mud and he's getting sacked a few times and getting hit and pressured, etc., that's where you're going to see the growth of this guy. Now, who knows what we're going to see in the Jet game and even in the final game against the Buffalo Bills, which will be up in Buffalo in their new stadium, which obviously has not gotten rave reviews in certain aspects. But I digress. When it comes to Aller, I really truly think that as long as he continues to grasp the offense, stays within himself, he made that great throw to Weejan. I understand that the cornerback fell on that play where he ran 75 yards up the seam before he was stopped at the shadow of the goal line. And for Aller to then bounce back, he did miss that pass to Nowakowski, but then on a read option quarterback draw, he ran it to the right into the end zone. And of course, with a guy being that big and with that size, I did mention Josh Allen, who knows how much of a factor he could be running the football just as much as he would be throwing the football. And again, I don't want to dismiss Will Howard. I don't want to dismiss even Mason Rudolph and their chances to have any success on this team, especially in the preseason. We can't think about the regular season just yet because we all know that's going to be Aaron Rodgers' job. But for Aller, he is going to be the one guy that I'm going to look at here. And just because he has another good preseason game against the Jets, or even another one after that against the Buffalo Bills, am I all of a sudden going to think that he is the quarterback of the future of the Pittsburgh Steelers? I'm not going to say that, but it's certainly going to be gradual, and it's certainly going to be baby steps to get to that point to where I'm sure myself as a fan, and even more so and more importantly, the coaching staff and the front office is going to look at this guy and say, well, this is why we drafted him as the number 3 pick in our draft after Jeremy Bernard and the offensive tackle, Max Ihiniker. I guess I said that right. I always have a bad problem with these names that are long and with a lot of vowels. But with all that being said, I wonder what you think about Drew Aller and what you saw there last night. Please leave a comment in the description box below. We'll banter back and forth about that to see whether or not you think that Aller could, I'm not saying he should or will be or would be, but could be a guy that the Steelers in the long term could be a fixture on the center and hopefully could be that guy that we had for 18 years on a one Ben Roethlisberger. And if Drew Aller could be half of Ben Roethlisberger, then I think we'd be in pretty decent shape. Now, as we get to the final topic that I want to get into, and it's also very important because it's not only about the quarterbacks, it's about the rest of the team, and some of the highlights from last night, as I'm going to mention here. And one other thing about Drew Aller before I even get to the last part. Aller, coming out of this draft, and everybody looks at this quarterback draft as one that was other than Fernando Mendoza. And Mendoza, who actually had a good night there out in the desert for the Raiders. But one last thing on Aller, how I see it too is that maybe he plays this training camp with a chip on his shoulder to know that he could have gotten drafted high, that he came from a big program. And even though Indiana, for Mendoza, won a national championship, but Aller would probably think that, hey, I belong on the same field as a guy like that, despite the fact that, shortcomings in big games, but because he has a winning record there at Penn State, that maybe he could be a guy that could even rival Mendoza when it's all said and done. But that we'll have to wait and see. But now, let me get to the last thing, the notables. Last night, the wide receivers, the DBs, and the linebackers, to me, stood out. Now, the offensive line, listen, they did their job. I understand that Mason Rudolph got sacked a couple times on opening drive. All right, can I nitpick about certain things? I could, but you know what? It's the first game. Just like I can't go crazy about Aller, and even though we like what we saw, or Howard, or Mason Rudolph, and the combination of the quarterbacks there last night, and we have to temper it by knowing that it was just the first preseason game. But with that being said, as far as the wide receiver, you like what you saw there from Caden Weegan, who had that long pass play. Now, he only had 2 catches in the game, but for Weegan, you saw that speed. And even though he stumbled a little bit, if it wasn't for that stumble, he probably could have gotten in the end zone. And here's a guy that is a small guy. He's 5'9", what is he, about 180, 190, but he runs a 4.4 40. You saw that lightning speed there as he tried to get separation from the defensive backs. But for Weegan, is this a guy that could possibly be in the running to be a part of this offense? Listen, it's still early, and if he's going to have big plays like that, the coaching staff's going to have to factor that in to see whether or not that they have a slot or a spot for Weegan when it's all said and done. Now, remember, I just mentioned Jeremy Bernard, who actually had a big contribution in the game last night. You want to take a look at what he's done. We all know about DK Metcalf, Michael Pittman, and that's just a wide receiver core. And I didn't even mention Roman Wilson, who I believe only had 1 catch in the game. So it is a very crowded room. And for Weegan, who had a big splash play, and knowing that he had that burst of speed there, I'm sure the coaching staff has that on notice to know that maybe we should give him some more plays in the next game against the Jets. Maybe we should give him some more opportunities to see what he could do. And Weegan, to me, that's like almost like a Wes Welker type. Now, I'm not trying to say he is Wes Welker by any means, or even Julian Edelman for that matter, when you think of the Patriots of yesteryear. But how I see Weegan, he's that type of guy. Small guy, shifty, obviously could run like the wind. So that was one positive that I saw there from the wide receivers. As far as the DBs go, I like what I saw from Dalen Everett. Now, it wasn't a lot in the short sample size that I saw him, but he was getting his hat to the ball. He was getting his nose and uniform dirty. And you like that. A kid that came out of Georgia who we would think with the injuries to Joey Porter Jr., and I actually talked about that in one of the previous videos when we talked about the defense overall and the guys that are going to need to step up, especially when you have not only Joey Porter Jr., but you also have Jalen Ramsey who's hurt. So Dalen Everett, who right now is trying to impress the coaching staff to see whether or not he could be a guy that's going to factor into this defense, because as we all know, they're going to need it in the worst way considering what they did last year. But for Everett, let's see what he does here in the next game and the final game against the Bills there in the preseason. And then lastly, the linebacker stood out, but the one guy that stood out the most to me was Jamin Davis, the former number 1 pick of the Commanders. And for him to step up in there, get a couple of sacks, and even though you saw Jack Sawyer get a half a sack, and we know that Sawyer, we would think, is going to be maybe not a prominent figure, but certainly a guy that may need to be counted on, especially if you're going to get injuries from the outside linebackers, whether it be the aging TJ Watt or Alex Highsmith, who's been known to succumb to an injury or two here throughout the last few years. So when you have Sawyer and Davis, who knows? Maybe those two guys could really step up and put this linebacker core, not necessarily on their shoulders, but certainly have a seamless transition from those aforementioned guys to know that those guys are ready to step in and ready to go. And you saw Cole Holcomb play a lot there in the game yesterday. Of course, he's the veteran also who played once upon a time with the Commanders or the Washington football team, whatever you want to call it. But how I see it with those guys that are going to fight for their jobs, and that's a guy like Weejan, Everett, although he was a mid-round pick, but still you would think that if he's going to continue to impress, he's going to be in good shape there to make the team. And then Davis, a guy, like I said, a former number 1 pick who now is finding a new home here in Pittsburgh and certainly had a first good impression, not only to the coaching staff, but even to the fans to say, hey, linebacker you, maybe there's a guy that could flourish and all of a sudden do some damage here for our team as we get set for the next preseason game and then obviously continuing training camp before we get to week 1 against the Falcons there on September 13th. So for more information, for more of the Steelers' latest, this is your channel to get everything that has to do with the black and gold. Please support the channel by hitting that subscribe button. I'd really appreciate it. And one more time, leave a comment in the description box. We'll go back and forth, banter, to discuss how these Steelers are shaping up and what you've seen so far as we get set for week 1 of the NFL season. Just now, 3 weeks from this coming Sunday. So stay tuned. And until next time, on the flip.